Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim wa bihi nasta'een. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everybody. How are you doing? Welcome to the frozen outdoors. I hope that train is not annoying you. There's a train going. I was waiting for it to finish, but let's just get started. I want to speak about something very important today. Something that goes to the core of what this channel is about, which is getting the modern Muslim to understand what is Islam's place in the world and what understanding about life does Islam give, so that the young Muslims of today and the old can have an Islamic lens upon life. You know, what is a lens? A lens is something that enables you to interpret the many facets of life through one understanding. It kind of grounds you, like the axioms of math grounds you through discovering new mathematical principles and theorems. This lens upon life that any ideology would provide, you know, different lenses, some of them being correct, some of them being incorrect, allow you to interpret life, allow you to interpret the world, interpret history, interpret the good, interpret the evil. And many Muslims lack the Islamic lens on life. So I wanted to hit on one ayah today. And this ayah, subhanallah, Allah makes it so simple. This Islamic lens on life, the understanding of what is Islam's role, what is our purpose and our meaning, encapsulated really in one ayah. The ayah is actually pretty long. It's about half a page, but it's not long compared to what it accomplishes. And like I said, many Muslims today remain confused. They think that Islam is not political. And in my videos, I speak about, you know, Islam is political and the mission of the prophets is a political mission, and people remain indignant. So let's allow the Qur'an to speak for itself. I'll recite the ayah and then we'll go through it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-Baqarah, كان الناس أمة واحدة فبعث الله النبيين مبشرين ومنذرين وأنزل معهم الكتاب بالحق ليحكم بين الناس فيما اختلفوا فيه وما اختلف فيه إلا الذين أوتوه من بعد ما جاءتهم البينات بغيا بينهم فهدى الله الذين آمنوا لما اختلفوا فيه من الحق بإذنه والله يهدي من يشاء إلى صراط مستقيم. So now let's dissect it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala starts, كان الناس أمة واحدة. In the beginning, the people were one nation. And this is what struck me. This is what drew my attention to this ayah. Because I just took a course on screenwriting, storytelling. And I noticed, like, the way that this ayah starts, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling a story. And the fact that He's starting from the beginning of humanity, when the people were one nation. Once upon a time, the people were one nation. I knew Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was about to say something very profound and essential to life and the human condition. So what does it mean, كَانَ النَّاسُ أُمَّةً وَاحِدَةً, that the people were one nation? Well, it means we were united upon one creed. As the Mufassirun have said, it means the people shared a deen, they shared an outlook on life, there was peace, there was harmony. And then something happens. Allah doesn't say what, but He does say that then He sends the prophets. So He sent the prophets to rectify something that had disturbed this unity upon an outlook on life that created harmony and peace. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَبَعَثَ اللَّهُ النَّبِيِّينَ مُبَشِّرِينَ وَمُنذِرِينَ. He sent the prophets as givers of glad tiding of heaven for those who obey, and the warning of hellfire for the opposite kind of person, to kind of tell people about the afterlife, right? Because this is the ultimate motivation for our activities, our behaviors, our beliefs in this world. And then, and this is the kicker, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and He sent with these prophets a book so that they may judge between the people in that which they dispute, in that which they differ. And this is a rejoinder to anyone who says that the mission of the prophets was not political, or Islam's purpose is not political. In this one ayah that encapsulates the story of man and the purpose of Islam and the prophets, mentions the bushra, the glad tiding and the warning, and then He mentions the role of the prophets to enact the legislation of God, the laws, so that they may judge between the people in their disputes. And notice how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala phrases it. The prophets resolve disputes and conflicts and differences between the people, because in human society, conflict is part of nature. Everybody has different interests, everybody has different biases. There's limited resources, there's limited time, there's limited possibilities. And for that reason, it becomes human nature for each of us to insist on our own self-interest, right? Like the buyer and the seller. The buyer's interest is to get the thing for the cheapest price possible. Sometimes that might mean he'll lie and cheat to do so. The seller likewise wants to sell for the most expensive price possible. If he has to lie and cheat to do so, sometimes that happens, right? So there's competing interests between different types of people in society, between employers and employees, between a husband and a wife, between a parent and a child. Because these conflicts are natural to human existence, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent the prophets with His law so that harmony can be restored, because a divine intelligence that is impartial, that is benevolent, that knows all, is the only entity that's going to be fit to legislate over mankind. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala clarifies this in the next part of the ayah. He says the people who reject this divine law, this divine intelligence, after having received it, only do so out of baghi between them. What is baghi? Baghi is transgression. We say that this river is frozen here, but if it weren't frozen, we would say this river bagha if it overflows the riverbank. So it's to say that something does baghi is to say that it exceeds its limits. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says people reject the divine law out of one reason and one reason only. It is to exceed their limits against each other. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't even say they transgress against Him, Allah. He says they reject the law to transgress upon each other. And this is the history of man. Since the medieval times and the feudal system to now with the capitalist system, the elite, the top 1%, who have control of the resources in the society, weaponize the law, place themselves as the master and legislator, so that they can exploit the rest of society, so that they can gain an edge on people, so that they can elevate their own status, right? And it makes sense if you think about it from a materialist perspective, that the mala, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about in many places in the Qur'an, the elite, are going to resist the message, because the message demotes everybody to the status of slave. Whereas in an ungodly society like ours, you have masters, human masters, and you have human slaves. In a godly society, everyone is relegated to the status of slave. We are all equally having no say in the sight of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He is the only legislator. And for that reason, the insincere, the ones who do not recognize or do not heed the glad tiding and the warning of the afterlife, they will always resist the message, because the message comes to say, no, you don't have a right to be king. You don't have a right to be master. You are just a slave like everybody else. Do you see how profound this idea is? The idea that if we just accept Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as our sole legislator, the conflict and chaos and evil that spreads throughout society, the subjugation that one man does to another, would become a thing of the past. But how many of you have had Islam explained to them this way? Like as this utopic political vision. Even the word utopic, like people sneer at that. As if Islam did not come to make something more of humanity. As if Islam did not come to raise humanity over their base desires and cruelties towards one another. Islam is something miraculous. We have to speak about it in grand terms. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about it in grand terms. The Prophet ﷺ speaks about it in grand terms. So this grand vision of ending evil in the world, ending the differences between people. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says He finishes the ayah by saying He guided the believers to this truth, which ends the differences between them. So when Islam is established among the Muslimin, we show the world the beauty, the light of the divine justice. People have this image of Islam as like spread by the sword and like hard power, coercion. I don't think so. I think most people in history converted to Islam not because of its hard power, but because of its soft power. Right? The Islamic system on display. Because, when Islam did expand, it did not force convert any of its populations. Their populations converted en masse because of the soft power of the Islamic system. The soft power which no longer exists today, Unfortunately, I heard one statistic. You know, the number of people in the world that convert to Islam every year is offset by the number of people who leave Islam every year. And that's just the people who become murtaddeen. Like, how about all the people who keep the name Muslim, but they don't practice anymore, they don't believe anymore, they just become cultural Muslims? And this state of affairs is really going to continue until we re-establish Islam and re-display the light of Islam to the world. Today, unfortunately, people think individual da'wah efforts, you know, pitching to John and Jane about what is Islam, is going to convert the masses. It's going to bring the world to Islam. It's not. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about it in the Qur'an. He says, إِذَا جَاءَ نَصْرُ اللَّهِ وَالْفَتْحُ وَرَأَيْتَ النَّاسَ يَدْخُلُونَ فِي دِينِ اللَّهِ أَفْوَاجًا. When you see the victory, when the victory of Islam comes, that's when people will enter into Islam in droves. Why? Because when the victory happens, Islam now has an opportunity to demonstrate its superiority as a system. People will have a chance to see, you know, here's kufr on one hand, you know, chaos, inefficiency, brutality, barbarism, and here's the light of Islam. So to summarize this ayah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, in the beginning, mankind was one nation. Something happened. Allah sent the prophets to fix that situation, as givers of glad tidings and warning of the afterlife, and with a book of laws to judge between the people. And the people who rejected the divine law, rejected Islam, are those who only sought to subjugate each other, to weaponize the law against each other, to exploit the 99% for their own gain and for their own status. And the believer, to be a believer, is to be somebody who takes upon that mission of establishing this law, of establishing this divine judgment in this world, against the desires of those who would seek to promote chaos and evil in the world for their own temporary benefit. Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.